We are now ready to move into Chapter 2, which talks about science research, and I'm going to connect theory to that in the next lecture. A couple things I want to say first. I know research or science sounds like a very overwhelming subject, so I want to make the point that I am just doing a quick overview. For some of you, this will be a review about science, but really every chapter in the textbook would be an entire semester, and particularly research, science, that type of thing. We have a course here at El Camino. It's Sociology 109, which is research. So I don't want you to be intimidated. I'm just going to go through this quickly, and we will hopefully get finished in a quick few minutes. These are the list of objectives, learning objectives for this entire chapter. We are going to look at, again, just some overview of different things that make science different as a way of knowing than other ways of knowing. I want to go back again to my definition of sociology that I used in the very first lecture. I said that it is the systematic study of the groups and societies that people build and how these groups and societies affect their behavior. So I've now come back to the first part of the definition, a systematic study. What this means is the scientific method. It is both a quantitative method and a qualitative method. Quantitative means that it uses numbers to measure certain things that people want to study. Qualitative does not use numbers. It uses, say, like someone's diary that they've written, or content analysis of a newspaper, that kind of thing. So it does not try to change it into a numerical system, but they both use the same process, as we will see as we go along. A very good question to ask is, what do we want to know in all of this scientific stuff? I have broken it down into three different parts. The first is description, and I'll use the example of poverty, the poor, since it is a very major problem in some areas of the United States. So we first start by describing who are the poor, how many are there, what are their age groups. So it's basically a description so that we know what we're dealing with. Sometimes this helps us to narrow down our topics of research, because then if we can describe these people, we might pick certain parts, their age, say, versus their location, and try to focus in on certain things rather than just trying to do everything. The second part is correlation, and that is where you take two different parts of the description and put them together. For example, one part is age, which I talked about, and what we see here is the people who are most likely to live in poverty in the United States are children under 18. Sorry to have to say that, but it is a correlation between age and poverty that obviously has held up since probably the 60s, in which it became very apparent. Okay. Sometimes we see a relationship that seems to exist, but is actually not true. It's caused by some other variable. It's called a spurious correlation. Children under 18, as we know, are least likely to work. So we don't want to say that they're in poverty because they're children, because we know that children are not allowed to work in the United States. So we don't want to blame it on their age necessarily. Okay, and then the last thing is causal, not to be confused with casual. Sometimes I type it too fast. And this is essentially what is the cause of poverty. This is where we get into the relationship with theory and explanations, and we'll talk more about theory as we continue. Okay, so we've now asked what do we want to know? And now the question is, how do we know it? And there are many ways that we know things. For example, the boss says it's true, so you believe it, or your mother says it's true. These are authorities. Also, we hear people say many times, oh, everybody knows that that's true. That's generally what we call consensus. Maybe crowdsourcing sometimes falls into that category. Everybody knows that this is the way to believe or to think, etc. There are many traditional beliefs that we really don't question. Certainly religion is one of them, because by definition, faith is the belief in something without proving it. So we can believe things that by these traditional beliefs. Also, personal experiences. I know it because it happened to me, so it must be true, right? We can be very selective. Often we are very selective in what we're looking at, or we have certain vested interest. I work for a particular organization. I work for the Coca-Cola company, so I'm going to see things that are favorable to that company. Or now we come down to the next phase, or we can know it by the scientific method, which is what we're going to talk about here. I just wanted to point out that science is not the only way we know things. Okay, so what is science? It's essentially a method. It's not what you know, it's how you know it. It is based on empirical evidence. What is empirical? Things that we can measure, things that we can observe, experimentation. Right? It's going to be very important to be able to measure certain things. That is less likely to happen in the qualitative approach than in the quantitative, but it can be done. Okay. Science is also systematic. It has set rules and procedures. This is the thing we call the scientific method, and we'll walk through that. The other thing that's important about science is it combines theory with research. Theory is an explanation. If you just have theory, it's your opinion. If you just have research, you have trivia. So you have to put the two together and come up with something that can be tested and worked with over a period of time. Which brings us to the last, characteristic of science. It is provisional. What does that mean? It means it has to be replicated. You don't do just one science experiment, you do many. You keep going, as we will see over and over again. The other thing is that it's open to the public. This is why scientists or researchers go to these conventions and sit there and talk to each other, talking about only the things that only they can appreciate and like. But essentially, this helps to point out any problems, any questions, any mistakes that might have been made. This is a problem, again, when you work for proprietary research, when you work for a private company that wants to keep its research, private. And it becomes a fine line that scientists must walk. We know this from World War II, when scientists had to keep their experiments on the atomic bomb a secret. It bothered a lot of them. They did it because their country was at war, but as soon as the war ended, they wanted to make it open to the public, because this is something that had been drilled into them forever. In this particular slide, I want to make the difference between a concept and a variable. Okay. A concept, you have an idea in your head and you want to give it a name. You look at how people behave and you say, that's tolerance. So that's a concept. You have to define it. You have to say, this is what I think tolerance is. People are tolerant if they interact with other groups of people without saying nasty things about them, so it's tolerance, okay? That's the concept, but now you have to turn it into something that you can measure. Again, I give the example on the slide of age. You first define it. What is age? Is it how old you feel? Is it the number of years that you've lived? You have to come to a definition so that you can then go to the second step, which is to measure it. So I have now defined age as how many years a person has lived. Well, am I going to ask them that? Am I going to ask them how old they are? Sometimes people forget how old they are. We have found the most reliable measurement for age is to, in terms of that definition, is to ask people, in what year were you born? People tend to remember that. Now that you have defined a concept and figured out a way to measure it, we are now going to put these measurable variables into what is called a hypothesis. When I ask what is a hypothesis, I get the answer that it's an educated guess. Well, hopefully people do some research and are educated to make this hypothesis, but sometimes they're not, so it's a guess. But better definition is to say it's a statement of a relationship of two variables. The statement can be tested because we have set up measurements for them. There are two things. There are a dependent variable in the relationship, and there is an independent variable. This one is always hard to get people to keep it clear in their head. All right, a dependent variable is the one that you're trying to explain. The independent variable is the one that you're using to explain the dependent variable. Okay, hopefully it makes sense. If you go to section 2.1 of the textbook, page 33, if you have a hard copy, look at table 2.1, and it will give you some examples of hypothesis, and then identify the dependent and the independent. So that's very helpful. Okay. What the scientific method gives us that the other ways of knowing does not are two things that are very important. It gives us validity and it gives us reliability. What is this? What is validity? Does the research method truly measure what it's intended to measure? Now, how are you going to know this? Because you're going to replicate it and keep seeing if the measure gives you the same results beyond the one study that you did. Okay? Now, there could be reasons for different results, but again, you have to keep doing it over and over again until you begin to see the pattern. Okay? So we're looking for validity. We're also looking for reliability. Can the results of one study be repeated using the same measurement in other studies? So these two things are very important for how we know. Here I have listed the steps in the research process. First, ask a question. In other words, you're selecting a topic. How is age related to tolerance? That's an example. Okay. So now the next step would be to review the literature. See what has been written before. See what other people have done so that you can see where that reliability is, where the validity is. It helps because you could use some of the same questions if the reliability has been established. I did that in my PhD thesis, the dissertation. I went back all the way to the 1940s and looked at research that had been done as far back as that, the 1940s and the Gallup poll. So I was looking for questions that I could use again. You notice that I put these in different colors. It's because I think the first two are very much like any research essay that you're asked to do in a class. You have to get your topic, what's that called, the thesis statement, right? And then go and do research about what people have done. The next step in the research process is to formulate the hypothesis. That could really be the conclusion of any essay that you write. Okay? So you're going to formulate a group of hypotheses, not just one, operationalize them, which essentially means figure out how to measure them, move them from concepts to variables. Then you're going to choose a research method. Okay? We'll talk about that in the next slide or the second slide. Using the research method you have picked, you're going to collect the data. Now you're going to analyze the results. And when it says share the results, that means you're going to write a report or give the results to some other person or place that they can do share the results. A very good group online right now is the Pew, P-E-W, Research Center. They do a lot of social research that is very, very good that you might use for, say, papers that you're writing. Here I show these steps in a different way. I show them as the circle, which I think is very, very important because, again, I keep emphasizing that science goes around and around. Okay, these are the research methods that this textbook identifies. You can find them in Table 2.2, which is page 46 of your text. They're very briefly surveys, fieldwork, experiments, and secondary data analysis. What I would ask you for this class is that you just be able to define these terms. So I'm going to let you get that from the textbook, just a definition. I don't expect you to know how to do them because you haven't taken a research course, but just to know what they are. So these four would be the ones that I would look for, say, on an exam or anything like that. And if you have any questions, just, ask them in the chat room or send me a message, whatever works best for you. Here I have listed the uses, 3 different uses for sociological research, all of which I think are very important. Basic sociology is the research itself, usually done in universities or in public interest groups, but sometimes a combination of both if there's a grant from a public organization to a university. But it is basically the research itself. Public sociology, which is becoming very important, is the whole idea that you're going to present this research to the public. Okay? You're going to tell them what the research shows you. It is, we could call it activism. These are people who are who want to present a point of view, say to a legislature or whatever. We have seen this, unfortunately, in the climate change public research, or the research that is presented to the public. And I don't think really that people get it yet, exactly what climate change is. I do recommend Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth, if you have not seen it, because what he's doing in that movie is presenting research to the public. And it was the first time that I said, oh, I get it. Okay? So that's very important, to present things to the public in a way that they get. Now, there is a third field, of course, and that is applied research. It's sometimes referred to as clinical sociology. You might have a counseling center. Family counseling involves everyone in the family. You can't just talk to one person. Same thing is true with drugs. A lot of clinical work. Because the social sciences deal with human subjects, over the years, people have realized we must have a code of ethics. The American Sociological Association does have a code of ethics. It talks about privacy, confidentiality, that you must tell people if you're doing some kind of experiment exactly what is happening. We have seen cases in the past which were just horrendous. Probably the worst that we know is that the work at the Tuskegee Institute, in which men were asked to volunteer. They were prisoners at the time, and they were not told that they were being injected with syphilis. So you can imagine the harm that was done to people. So because of those things, which happened in the 1930s, I have to say, there have been some concern about ethics, and so codes have been written. If there is any potential for harm in either conducting the study or potential harm in publication of results, many times people's names are not revealed, which helps to protect them in that way. But a very important concern is ethics when you're dealing with people. Okay, I hope that we did what I had said at the beginning, which was to go through quickly in chapter 2. So we finished chapter 2. In the next lecture, I'm going to actually apply the research method using Durkheim's study of suicide. So I think you will find that to be very interesting. So if there are any questions, just get in touch with me. But other than that, we are moving along.